And that's going to be problematic for thinking about any of the type of applications I was talking about before, like newspapers, because obviously, like, whether it's another advertiser or whether it's someone who's reading it matters a lot to whether the advertisers want to participate. But I think this will show you the basic logic, and it will be pretty easy to generalize once you see sort of how it works. It might be relevant for maybe a telecommunications network that just matters how many people are involved. Okay, so users, as in the Spence model, are going to have some utility for joining, which depends on the number of people. That's now the characteristic, right? Rather than there being this characteristic that's external, it's how many people are joining and their type. And so now notice that the number of people is the only choice variable. And it's going to serve two different roles, right? It's both going to serve the role that n served from before and the role that rho served from before. So both of those roles of the instrument and the number of people have been collapsed into one thing, right? So what happens to the price when you increase the number of people? Well, again, there's the role that it served as n, which is -1 over m. But then there's also the role that it served as rho, which is the average marginal utility that people get out of it. You just stick those together. And so what that means is the price may either rise or fall as the number of people increases, at least over some ranges. And one interesting implication that has, which is actually in a paper that Gary wrote, is imagine you can't actually sell more of the good, but just how many people want to buy the good has an effect on your utility. So that's a little bit like the case you were talking about, but not informational. It's just directly. You just want to be doing what's popular. Then actually, you might not raise your price, even though you have excess demand, because it would reduce the number of people, and then that would lead you down to a bad equilibrium, right? Yeah, Andre.
Is that like the social multiplier of Becker when you have lots of people?
It's exactly the same thing. Well, I mean, I'm writing it in a different way, but my work on platforms, which this is going through, is basically very much related to Becker's work on this sort of stuff. Yeah.
So you're assuming that the utility increases the more people there are?
Not necessarily. It could decrease.
But if it's negative, then it's...
Well, then it's down with something. Yeah. Then everything's fine. So if there's congestion rather than positive externalities, you're absolutely right. So this could just be increasing even more rapidly then. Yeah. So for everything else, to do all the analysis, all we now need to do relative to the Spence model is just collapse the two things together. Where in the Spence we have these two separate things, now we just make them one thing and everything is just as it was before. So we have the cost as a function of the number of people rather than as a function of the number of people in the instrument. And then the social value, well, we just take the two terms that came out of the expression before and we just make them one. So the derivative is price minus marginal cost plus the utility that people get out of having more people. And marginal cost, of course, is just the derivative of cost. What's the private value? Here I actually got it right. You, again, have the marginal revenue minus marginal cost, but then plus the utility of the marginal guys is equal to 0, right? And then if we just label, I'm now going to label n over m as, or p prime n as mu, just to be able to keep track of that. That's just the difference between the price and the marginal revenue, or the market power, Cournot distortion, the thing you were talking about the other day. Okay, so then the formula is exactly what you think. So what is going to be the socially optimal level Meredith? Is Meredith here? No. Does anyone who sees Meredith here, but Meredith is refusing to say it, is willing to rat out Meredith? Okay. So the price is equal to marginal cost minus the externality, right? That is like literally just Pagoo's rule, right? The socially optimal thing is that price is equal to marginal cost minus the number of people who get the externality times the average benefit that it brings to them, right? Super simple. How about the monopolist optimum? Anita's not here either. She's actually not here, right? Okay. Anita, if she You want to go for it? Yeah, go for it. Go for it. What is the monopolist? Yeah. So there's two distortions, right? Yeah, because they're stuck together. So it's price equals marginal cost plus the Cournot distortion, and then you have to subtract off the average marginal utility to the marginal guy, which differs from what the social planner would take into account by the Spence distortion, right? So there's two distortions now, right? There's a Cournot distortion, and there's a Spence distortion, right? So, and of course, both of these things may go either way. It'll be clear when I talk about two-sided markets exactly how I fit these things in, but think about a newspaper and the advertisers, right? The marginal reader of the New York Times, probably someone in like rural, Nebraska or something like that, compared to someone who's probably an inframarginal reader of the New York Times, probably most of the people in this room, right? We probably dislike the advertisements more than the marginal reader does. Because, we feel intellectually averse to having all these advertisements around and so forth, right? So in that case, the Spence distortion is actually going to cater too much to the person in Nebraska, and it will actually lead to too low of a price for advertising, right? Because they don't dislike advertising as much as we do, right? On the other hand, in a credit card, the inframarginal user of a credit card almost certainly likes having merchants accept the card more than a marginal user does. But sort of by definition, because they're an inframarginal user, they're someone who values the ability to use their credit card more, right? And so the key thing is that that this interacts in a really interesting way with the Cournot distortion. Because if the newspaper, if the price on the newspaper, the price of advertising in the newspaper is too low because of the Spence distortion, but then there's also the Cournot distortion, that actually may make things better. So it may be actually good that they have market power over advertisers because it helps offset the fact that they're not fully taking into account the disutility that people get. On the other hand, in credit cards, rather than the market power that they have over the merchants being a second order harm, like a little triangle, it's actually going to be more like a square, a rectangle, because you already have this Spence distortion. So these things can interact with each other in quite interesting ways. And I think that in many ways in a platform, the Spence distortion is even more important than it is in a standard market. Because in a standard market, often when you have quality, you might have different products of different quality to appeal to different consumers. Whereas in these types of situations, it's pretty hard to do that. To have like different newspapers with different numbers of ads, right? Or to have different credit cards that you can use at different numbers of places. In principle, you could have that, but in practice, it's very practically difficult to do that because it's this platform and everyone sort of connects with everyone else. Yeah.
But I mean, if the Washington Post, for example, has a free version that's much smaller you can pick up in the subway or that has a different level of ads as well. Or is that more about price?
It's true. I mean, no. I mean, it's not that this is impossible, but it's pretty uncommon in these types of industries, and it's pretty tough to do that. But people do it occasionally. Yeah. Okay. So, in many, if not most cases, where these types of user-generated characteristics are important, there are different distinct groups of users, and most of whom get value from interacting with the other group rather than with their own group. So these are usually called sides of the market, and I denote them, by A, B, C, etc. Readers and advertisers, cardholders and acceptors, etc. And there's a slight bit more notation in writing this stuff down, which is the reason that I didn't do it on the previous slide. I didn't do it to develop the model, but the formula is basically exactly the same, right? The social optimum is just price is equal to marginal cost minus the sum over all the sides of the externalities that you bring to the people on those sides. And the private optimum is that price equals marginal cost plus the Cournot distortion of u minus the value that you're bringing to marginal users on all the other sides. Right? Yeah. Well, so as we talked about in the earlier lecture, right, the monopoly model can be applied to any case when you have a residual monopoly. So as long as the firm has some market power, this is a useful way to go about it. But the welfare effects can differ quite a bit if you are taking people away from another firm. And I'll actually go through some of the additional complications that come in that case. But I think to a first approximation, think about the hoteling example. There people were competing, but the same basic logic applied, right? And so in many cases, even though people are competing, along your residual demand curve, you still have some downward slope, and so you sort of act like a monopolist. Okay. So users often care not only, another mistake, not only about the number of people, this is right. In the model that I just presented, everybody cared only about how many people were participating, not who was participating, including in this model. Even though I broke it up into distinct groups, within each group, you cared only about how many people were participating, not who was participating. But in many cases, the key is not to attract a lot of users, but the right types of users, right? So one classic example of this is soap operas. So soap operas are called soap operas because they were designed to sell soap to the women who were thought to be in charge of making those decisions for their families, right? And they therefore designed them to be very melodramatic because they thought that that would appeal to the people that they were trying to sell the soap to, right? American Express offers tons of travel services to people who use its card because it thinks that the people who value having travel services are also sort of like free-spending, high living types who will use their card a lot and therefore generate them a lot of money off of the merchants, right? And this applies in a broad range of contexts that aren't even platforms. So for example, when you think about how much insurance coverage do you want to offer, you have to think about, is that going to attract people who are relatively sick? Or if I think about how much of a down payment to demand, that might be a way to screen out people who are like who are subprime borrowers, basically, right? So in all of these cases, the key is that different users make heterogeneous contributions to the value of your service, right? And so in this case, the instruments that you have, including the user-generated instruments, right, are now going to serve to sort users and not just to attract them, right? Okay, so the simplest model of this is that users generate some characteristic that depends on their type. And what I mean by that is that people are going to have some utility which depends on the total amount of this characteristic that's generated by all people that participate. So before, everyone was just generating one unit of the characteristic, so it was just the number of people that mattered. But now it's going to be the number plus the average value of this characteristic among those people, and the platform's cost is going to depend on the number of people, again, using marginal cost of no fee. And here's just what I said. The total amount of the characteristic is the integral over all people who participate of the characteristic, rather than just the number of people. Okay, so users in this model are going to be heterogeneous, both in terms of their preferences, right? Because their type determines how much they value the characteristic and what their utility is, but also in terms of their contribution to the character, to the value of the type. So people are heterogeneous sort of in these two different ways. And the key to all the analysis is just going to be the relationship between these two different types of heterogeneity. The relationship between preferences and contribution. And that's pretty obvious from the examples I gave, right? The point was that if you believe that women like melodrama more and that they use their, they buy more stuff for the family, then you're going to want to make it more